So now we'll move on to considering the amygdala. The amygdala is located low down in the cortical hemispheres, lower down than the basal ganglia and a bit further forward than the hippocampus. This is a vertical or coronal section of a brain, cutting across near the front of the ears. The location of the left hemisphere amygdala is indicated by the green circle. If we take the region in the rectangle, which includes both amygdalas, and enlarge it, you can see the entorhinal cortex under the brain, which ends in the amygdala. Remember that further towards the back of the brain, the entorhinal cortex ends with the hippocampus. Above the amygdala are the basal ganglia. If we focus on the left amygdala within the rectangle and enlarge that, you can make out the cortical nucleus of the amygdala right next to the entorhinal cortex. The cortical nucleus contains neurons very similar to the cortex neurons, and even some limited layering of pyramidal-like neurons can be seen. Then there are three more nuclei that also contain pyramidals and interneurons looking much like the cortex. In addition to these cortex-like nuclei, the amygdala has a couple of nuclei that contain neurons resembling the striatum in the basal ganglia, which is of course located just above the amygdala. Furthermore, the pattern of connectivity of the cortex-like nuclei has some resemblances to the connectivity of the cortex, and the connectivity of the striatal-like nuclei somewhat resembles that of the striatum. For example, the cortex-like nuclei have lots of inputs from the cortex, the hippocampus and the thalamus, and also make outputs to the cortex, hippocampus and thalamus, although in the case of the cortex it's mainly the frontal cortex. In addition, the lateral nucleus in particular gets strong input from the hypothalamus. Again, like the cortex, the cortical nuclei project to both the dorsal and the ventral striatum. The striatal-like nuclei, like the striatum, receive inputs from the cortex, hippocampus and thalamus, and one of these nuclei projects to the thalamus. But less like the striatum, the nuclei get strong input from the hypothalamus and also project back to the hypothalamus. In addition, there's a range of other brain structures that are connected to these nuclei but are not strongly connected to the striatum. There's a very pronounced pattern of connectivity between these nuclei, and the major nuclei have a number of subdivisions, such as the illustrated divisions of the lateral nucleus and the basal nucleus, and there's a strong pattern of connectivity between these subdivisions. Now, at one time it was argued that the amygdala was not really one structure, given the cortical and striatal-like segments, but the pattern of connectivity is now taken to indicate that it can be regarded as a single unit. So, having a quick look at the neurons of the amygdala, as I've already commented, the neurons in the basolateral group of nuclei are similar to cortical neurons, and about 85% of the neurons in those nuclei are pyramidal, pyramidal glutamatergic projection neurons, and the interneurons are GABAergic. However, in the cortex, a pyramidal neuron has one prominent apical dendrite, and the apical dendrites are all aligned in parallel, perpendicular to the sheet of the cortex. In the amygdala, the pyramidal neurons are sometimes a bit less spiny, and in some cases they don't have a prominent apical dendrite. In other cases, they have one or even two apical dendrites, but these dendrites aren't aligned in parallel. The medium spiny projection neurons in the striatal-like amygdala are GABAergic and strongly resemble the striatal projection neurons, and the sparsely spiny interneurons are generally also GABAergic. So what's the role of the amygdala, and as far as we can determine it? The amygdala seems to play a role in a range of emotions, such as fear. In the development of an infant, strengthening of the connections in the brain between the amygdala and the cortex correlates with the appearance of greater suspicion of strangers. MRI imaging of adult subjects shows that the degree of activity in the amygdala correlates with how the person describes their emotional state, including the degree of anger, sadness, and disgust, as well as fear. And after highly emotional experiences, there's often an enhanced memory for the general circumstances, although memory for details isn't enhanced, and the degree of activation of the amygdala predicts the degree to which such an enhancement will occur. And furthermore, damage to the amygdala can result in these enhanced memories no longer forming. And there are some other deficits that seem to be related to the amygdala. In autism, social relationships don't develop normally, and it appears that both the amygdala and the hippocampus have reduced volume, and also smaller and simpler neurons with less complex dendrites. But on the other hand, changes in autism are also found sometimes in the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the cortex. In attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it appears that the amygdala is smaller, and the size deficiency correlates with the severity of symptoms. Actual damage to the amygdala, especially if both the left and right amygdala are affected, can result in a number of deficits, including difficulty in determining the emotional state of another person, whether they're angry, afraid, sad, and so on, from the expression on their face. So in summary, the amygdala has a complex combination of subnuclei, some resembling the cortex in neuron type and connectivity, others resembling the striatum in the basal ganglia. One difference in connectivity is the strong reciprocal connection of the striatal-like amygdala with the hypothalamus. And finally, the amygdala appears to play a prominent role in emotions.